Okay, it's 1/2 past. So with that, I want to wish you welcome to the high-tech webinar on GDPR for the self-storage industry. The webinar is scheduled to take half an hour, and the last 10 minutes are dedicated to you being able to ask us questions. So if any questions pop up along the way, you just write them down in the chat that you just used to say hello, and then I'll answer as many questions as I can in the time that we have left. And if your question doesn't get answered, then you're always welcome to send an email after the webinar and we'll answer you then. So with that, we're ready to get going. Some of you are existing clients of ours. Some may have spoken to us at the trade show in Berlin a few weeks ago, and others might have received an email invitation to this webinar. So I thought it would be a good idea to just give you an introduction to who we are. High-tech has been a supplier to the European self-storage industry for the last 20 years. It started off as a software company, it grew into an IT company, and now it's also a consultancy company. Within the area of IT, we write our own software, and we offer private cloud environments for companies of all sizes. For some companies, we're also their outsourced IT department, so we're very much like a one-stop shop for IT in the self-storage industry. The consultancy side of our business grew out of the fact that our team has about 60 years of combined experience in the European self-storage market. And as we worked with our existing clients on various projects, we could see that we're actually quite unique in that regard, and that there was a need to sometimes ask for a second opinion or get a new perspective on something, but from someone who really knows the industry. And that's how the consultancy side of our business started off. Now, because of our background, we of course offer advice on IT, but we also have 2 marketing consultants who've conducted research on the European self-storage market, and I'm one of them. My name is Christel. I've worked for one of the big chains in Europe for about 7 years. I've worked both at store level and management level, and as part of my MBA, I researched how the European recession affected marketing messaging in the self-storage industry. So we also consult on business strategy and marketing, and we have certified project managers that can be hired in for both IT projects and business projects. Our existing clients are mainly in Europe, and we service both bigger chains and smaller operators. We're a team of 8. Our head office is in the Netherlands, not far from Amsterdam. So now you know who we are, so let's also just get clear on who we aren't. We're going to be talking about laws today, so it's important to point out at this point that we are not lawyers in your local country, we are consultants on a European level. We aren't going to be covering every single aspect of GDPR over the next 20 minutes. We're only going to be scratching the surface. 20 minutes isn't nearly enough to get to the bottom of GDPR. Because GDPR is a set of European-wide legislation, it will be implemented in each EU country. So while we can offer general advice on GDPR, we can't offer advice on the specifics of GDPR in your country and how it interacts with your local legislation. Now, as we've been working with our existing clients to get them ready for GDPR, and also as we work on getting our own systems compliant, we've collected up what we believe are the key areas that self-storage companies should be looking at. And that is what we're going to be spending some time on today. The 5 most important areas to look at when you start working on compliance. Now, this is a free webinar, and I'm sure that 1 or 2 of you have thought, I wonder if she's going to try and sell me something. So I want to answer that one straight off and say, no, I'm not going to try and sell you something. But on one of the very last slides, I will tell you how we can help in the area of GDPR if you want us to. So let's start with some basics. What is GDPR? GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's a set of data protection laws that come into force all over Europe on the 25th of May next year. The fundamental aim of the GDPR is to make sure that all businesses, all organizations, put data protection at the heart of the various aspects of their business, basically to make sure that everyone takes data protection seriously. Now, if you've Googled a bit about GDPR, you will have come across the term controller and processor. These aren't terms that I'm going to be using much today, but I do want to mention them because they're used in a lot of written material about the GDPR. And in GDPR terms, a controller would be your self-storage company, and the processor would be any subcontractor or supplier who processes personal data on your behalf and under instructions from you. So if you're one of our clients, then you're the controller and we are your processor. So now that we have some of the basics in place, let's look at the 5 most important areas for self-storage companies to start on with compliance. And the first one is governance. GDPR talks a lot about data protection officers, and if you Google it, you'll find data protection officers mentioned a lot in conjunction with GDPR. The data protection officer is the person in the organization that's responsible for data protection and responsible for compliance. So the big question is, do you need one? And at this point, I want to make sure to bust one of the myths about GDPR, because in some of the material that you'll read about GDPR, it will say that if you employ less than 250 people, that you don't need a data protection officer. Now, this would essentially mean that all small and medium-sized businesses don't need one. But the European Commission made a very clear statement about this in June this year, and they made it clear that whether you need a data protection officer or not depends on what data you hold and how you process it, not at all how big you are. So the question of whether you need a data protection officer is one that every business, no matter how big or small you are, will need to clarify. Now, there are a number of requirements relating to this, so it's not something we can go into detail on in this webinar, but it is an area where you'll need to clarify with your local lawyer whether you need a data protection officer or not. You'll need to create a governance structure for your data protection, where you specify who's responsible for what in terms of your data and how it's held, how it's used, and how it's processed. You'll also need to define who reports to who when it comes to data protection and who has the ultimate responsibility within your company when it comes to questions relating to data protection. In terms of your store staff, you'll specifically need to clarify what their responsibilities are and make sure that they've been trained on the aspects of data protection that affect the work that they do. They need to know what's an acceptable and what's an unacceptable use of personal data because they come in contact with it every single day. We're going to talk more about documentation in a little while, but just in relation to training, it's really important also to note that it's not enough that you train your staff. You need to be able to document that you've trained them and what you've trained them on. Now, the second area we're going to look at is consent notices, and this is maybe the place where on a day-to-day practical level, GDPR differs the most from previous data protection laws. So as of May next year, privacy consent can no longer be part of your general terms and conditions. It needs to be a separate document. Now, what does this document need to include? You need to include what the legal basis is for why you're asking your customers for their personal data, but the notices need to be written in plain language so that anyone can understand what it means. So you need to explain something legal without using any legal jargon. Now, that's a challenge in itself. The GDPR requires that it should be as easy to give consent as it is to withdraw consent. So this is an area to look at and make sure that you have operational processes for both of these situations. If you have a customer portal on your website where your customers can log on and manage their account, then this is quite easy to implement. But this is also an area that you'll want to speak to your software suppliers about to make sure that you have an easy and bulletproof way of handling consent automatically. Your consent notices have to include what's called your retention period. That means how long you'll hold their personal data before you delete it. You also need to inform them that they have the right to complain if they think that you aren't handling their data in a responsible way. And you also need to include a list of suppliers who hold their data on your behalf, so the customers can see who your suppliers are and even contact them directly if they want to. Now, when I'm going through this, there may be some of you out there thinking, well, what about my existing customers? And that is a very good question. The consent that you currently have will not be enough after the 25th of May next year. So you need to get renewed consent from your existing customers. So it could be a good idea to update your consent processes to be GDPR compliant as soon as possible, so that your new customers go straight on to the new consent forms. That will reduce the number of customers that you need to contact next spring to get renewed consent from. Now, next, we're going to be talking about data breaches. This is typically a security breach of some kind in your IT environment, where there's a chance that the personal data that you hold has been available to unauthorized parties. But if you store customer information on paper, like rental contracts, then a data breach could also be a break-in in your store. First of all, the governance structure that we talked about earlier needs to include a clear governance structure for data breaches, so that everyone knows immediately what to do if there is a security breach. Now, if there is a breach, then you have 72 hours to inform your local authorities about the breach, and in some circumstances, you'll also need to inform the customers that have been affected. This is required if the data breach may affect the person's rights or freedoms, is what the GDPR says. Now, many self-storage professionals that we've spoken to about GDPR initially say that, well, this isn't really something that applies to them because they don't hold data that's sensitive enough to affect a person's freedoms or rights. But when you start breaking it down into customer groups, it's not quite so clear-cut. Let me give you an example. If your company or if your country has a legal way of having a non-listed or secret address, this could, for example, be used for women who are leaving abusive relationships or people with other sensitive situations, then a data breach of this customer's address alone would be a risk to the person's rights and freedoms. Now, this may sound like a technicality, but is actually a really important point to clarify with your lawyer, so that you know what to do before you ever experience a breach. Because once the breach happens, you only have 72 hours to react. So it's extremely important that you know exactly what to do and also what not to do. Finally, a point about insurances. Insurance companies all over Europe are updating their coverages to include provisions for data breaches relating to GDPR. So this is an area to consult your insurance company on as well. Now, next we're going to be talking about documentation. And we'll start at looking a little bit about what to document. At the top of the list should be your governance structure, which we talked about a little while ago. You need to document what you've trained your staff on and when. You need to be able to document consent, both who has given consent and who has withdrawn consent. Whenever you make a technological change that affects any aspect of how personal data is either stored or handled or processed, you need to make what's called a privacy impact assessment. This can be quicker than it sounds, first of all, if you have the right template, but it's important that you can document that you've carried out the assessment, even if it is a really short one. What the assessment basically is an evaluation of your change, your technological change, and whether or not it has any implication for the handling of personal data. So basically what you're documenting is that you thought about the implications of data protection before you made a technological change. That's the purpose of the privacy impact assessment. Since you most likely don't process data yourself, but your suppliers do on your behalf, whether it's a software supplier, an IT supplier, or even your bank, you need to make sure that they can produce a record of processing that lives up to the GDPR requirements. Again, we don't have time to go into every detail of what this record needs to include, but on a high-level overview, you need to be able to document what's being processed when, by whom, but also why. Like we spoke about a little while ago, you need to document various aspects of data breaches. These are the main things to focus your documentation on, but of course there's more to the list. So we're going to spend a minute and just look at how to document. You're not required to document electronically, so you can do it on paper, but we highly recommend electronic documentation. You can create Word documents and put in a folder somewhere, but in our experience, this often leads to documentation becoming outdated quickly because it's not used actively and then it gets a bit forgotten and doesn't get updated. That's why we recommend wiki-style tools with a good search function at its heart. At High-Tech, we use a product called Confluence, and it's also something that some of our clients use. It's a tool that I'll tell you a little bit more about in a while. The Self-Storage Association is working on GDPR initiatives, and I believe that they'll be creating some templates that self-storage companies can use to make the whole documentation process a bit easier as well. So when you go to speak to your lawyer, what should be top of your list? First of all, absolutely new consent notices so that you can get it to your customers as soon as possible and reduce the number of existing customers that you need to contact next spring. What your specific requirements are in the event of a data breach is also incredibly important to be clear on. Your supplier contracts will need to be reviewed. They'll probably also need to be updated. And you should especially be making sure that your suppliers of software and IT can live up to the requirement of deleting and exporting customers upon request. This is known as the right to be forgotten and the right to data portability. Now, if you go onto the internet and Google and you read some articles on GDPR, then you'll see these two rights mentioned quite a lot because they're some of the new initiatives that are introduced in the GDPR. We won't be going into detail on these here, but for now, just make a note that this is something that you need to check with your system suppliers. You also need to know for certain whether you need a data protection officer in your company. And like I've mentioned a few times already, you'll need to check with your insurance company to make sure that you have the coverage level that you're comfortable with. So with this, you're ready to go. Well, almost. Looking at next steps, apart from the legal advice that we just spoke about, like I mentioned, the SSA is going to be a good resource for information on this topic, and I know that they've been working on putting together GDPR-related resources for a while already. We also help companies with GDPR in a number of ways. I mentioned earlier that we use a software package called Confluence, and at this point I want to make it absolutely clear that we do not get any commission whatsoever for recommending Confluence to others. So this is purely on the list because we believe that it's the best documentation solution out there for self-storage businesses. Now, Confluence offer a free 30-day trial, and as part of this webinar, we're actually also offering to help you get started with Confluence completely free of charge, if you want us to, of course. So in the link that we send out after the webinar, where you get a recording where you can listen to the webinar again, then we'll also include information about Confluence, and then you can judge for yourself whether you think that this would be something to try or not. If you feel like you don't have the time to document everything that needs documenting, then we can help write everything up for you as well. We have developed templates, etc., so we can hit the ground running and save time for everyone. And if you just want someone to take the whole topic of GDPR readiness off your table, we can manage your GDPR compliance as a project where we work on your behalf together with your lawyer and your suppliers to put together documentation and processes that get you compliant in time for May next year. Now we've got off to this part where it's open, the floor is open for anyone to ask questions. So if you have any questions that have popped up during these past 20 minutes, then just pop them in the comments in the little chat here on the webinar, and I'll work through as many as possible. So let me just have a look what we have. Here's a good one. If people want to withdraw consent, is it sufficient if we include an unsubscribe button in every email? Now, that's a very good question, because the unsubscribe button at the bottom of an email allows whoever receives the email to unsubscribe from your mailing list. But what the GDPR does is looks at not only who you're sending emails to, but how you are handling, holding, and processing data. So all of the data that you have on your computers, on your servers, and in your files in your office. So the answer to the question is basically no. It's not enough to include an unsubscribe button in every email. That's a good tool to allow people to unsubscribe from your mailing list. But in terms of them withdrawing consent for you to handle their personal data, it's simply not enough. Now let me see what else we have here. Let's see. Oh, here's one from the UK. It says the UK is leaving the EU in the coming years, so do we need to comply? And the answer to that one is a big, absolutely yes. The UK will be in the EU come 25th of May next year, and as such, the UK has to comply with European law at that point. Also, a number of lawyers, etc., have analyzed it. And no matter what resource you find on the internet, or no matter which lawyer you go to, they will tell you that the UK will need to comply with GDPR. Let's see what else we have here. Yes, here it says, I heard that under the GDPR, people may ask you to remove their personal data. How can we anonymize personal data from invoices, for example? This is also a really, really good question, and one that's actually much more complicated when you start digging into it than it actually sounds. Now, if someone asks you to remove their personal data, then that's what's called the right to be forgotten, which is something I mentioned just a little while ago. And if a customer or also an employee for that matter, anyone who you hold personal data on, come May next year, has the right to approach you and say, you hold personal data about me, I want you to delete all of it. Removing the customer from, say, your self-storage software might be quite straightforward if your software can handle that. But you probably have historical backups. You probably have invoices that go back X number of years in order to support your financial reporting, etc. There can be a whole lot of scenarios where you actually hold personal data. And so if someone requests you to remove their data, the request is to move everything. And under the GDPR, every customer, every employee, all of us have the right to request that to happen. So exactly how that happens and exactly how that's done is something that you need to speak to your software suppliers and your IT suppliers about. But for example, anonymizing, the question includes here about how we can anonymize personal data from invoices. This is something that, again, can be done, but it's not something that a piece of software can automatically just do. So it's really something where you need to have an in-depth discussion with whatever suppliers you use that hold data and make sure that all of them can comply with them. It's not enough that it's your main supplier. If you have say a website that collects contact details and addresses, well then your web provider will need to also be able to delete everything. If you have a finance system that your self-storage software feeds into, then the finance system will also need to be able to delete all of this information. So, this is really one of the more complicated or complex areas of GDPR. And I can't give you a straight up and down answer on exactly how it's done because it depends on about 1,000 different factors about how your entire IT is set up. Here I have a question saying, GDPR changes consent a lot, and that's absolutely correct. How can we make sure our consent is understandable for everyone? Yeah, this goes back to what I spoke to you about earlier about that consent notices need to give a lot of legal information, but the GDPR is also very clear that it has to live up to, it has to avoid any kind of legal jargon so that anyone can understand it. How to do that is to write it in a really conversational style. So don't try and make it sound formal. Make sure that you understand the legal basis of it. And then write something as if you were explaining it to someone over a coffee. Write that down and then have your lawyer just double check that that from a legal point of view, it's all accurate. And then that is usually a good approach to creating something that is very easily understandable, but also lives up to the new requirements. There's another one here about data breaches. In case of a data breach, how should we inform customers? Now, the GDPR doesn't require you to inform them in a specific way, but you will need to document, the big keyword, you will need to document that you have informed them. So any kind of written information will be compliant with GDPR. So you can send an email, you can send a letter, but phoning them might be great from a customer service point of view. So there's no one saying you can't phone them as well, but make sure if you phone them, then you also follow up with an email to confirm the phone call, and then that email is attached to the customer account so that you can at any point document that this customer was contacted about the data breach. They've been informed about X, Y, Z, and next steps are agreed to be so-and-so. I can see now that we're starting to run out of time, so I will finish with the questions there, and there are still a few there, so if your question hasn't been answered, just send it through to me as an email. You all have my email address, I think, and if not, then you can just reply to the follow-up email after the webinar, and we'll answer any questions that you have left. So before we finish off, I just wanted to tell you that our next webinar is on the 29th of November, and it's going to be on online marketing. My colleague Ifo is an online marketing expert, and he's going to be sharing 3 very practical tips about how you can increase traffic and conversion to your website. We'll be sending out an invitation to you in the next few weeks, so feel free to join us for that one if you're interested. So with that, the only thing remaining is for me to thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all a great day. Thank you for now.